And we are live. Welcome back, everybody. I'm very excited to be here with Marieke Flament, the CEO of Near Foundation, one of the most hardworking and respected CEOs in Web3. Marieke, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you, Anthony, for having me here. Yeah, doing well. Definitely, it's been quite a year. I can't believe we're almost at the end of 2022, which feels like it's been 10 years. But yeah, very good.
It's been a big year. Some good, some bad. A lot of hard work, a lot of code cut, a lot of progress, a lot of ecosystems that have grown significantly, not least of which yours. Before we get started, for those of you who haven't met you before, who don't know your story and background, could you give us a couple of minutes on kind of your recent experience in Web3, maybe even pre-Near, and then a little bit about what is Near Foundation and what have you guys been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I fell into crypto towards the end of 2015. At the time, I was working for Expedia, and I was actually asked if I could join Circle, which at the time was still, a small startup. In hindsight, probably one of the turning points, deciding point of my career, because I jumped into crypto. At the time, I hadn't heard about neither blockchain or any of that. I was at Circle for almost 4 years in a different roles. So first as managing director for Europe, Middle East and Africa, and basically looking at how we could expand what we had, and then also as their chief marketing officer. I then left in early 2019 and changed gear and tacked quite a bit. I worked for a bank. Some of you who might be in the UK actually might know that bank. It's NatWest. And at NatWest, I was actually leading their neobank Metal. So totally different experience, but actually also extremely insightful and helpful, because Metal is for actually the creator economy and the sole traders, and how do you actually innovate within a larger corporate. And then towards the end of 2021, actually, the Near team reached out, and I hadn't heard of Near, but when I started looking again at the crypto space and blockchain, I thought Near was fascinating because the tech was actually doing the promises of what we had been talking a lot about, Web3 and tokenizing everything and so on and so forth. And I fell completely in love with actually the technology, the team, and the ecosystem. The Near ecosystem, I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but already at the time was extremely diverse and inclusive, was made of builders and people who really want to build and believe in the technology and believe in what it can do to actually change potentially, how we do things, and also, let's be grand, change the world. So I joined Near Foundation as the CEO almost exactly a year ago in January 2022. It feels like 10 years ago, but January 2022, it's been an absolutely fascinating and phenomenal experience. And so Near, and to close on that, but Near is a layer 1 protocol. And around it, we have a whole ecosystem of infrastructure play that are built around the Near protocol, but also ecosystem dApps and projects that go from actually DeFi, entertainment, NFT, DAOs, anything you can imagine. And the role of the foundation is basically threefold. One is actually to help raise awareness of what is Near, what is Web3, and what can be done on that. The second part is actually to help support the growth of the ecosystem. So what are, the tools, what are, in a way, the roads that need to be built for the ecosystem to function, the content, the material that is needed for that to work. And the third point is actually enabling and empowering the decentralization of the ecosystem through governance, and thinking also through regulation, which are also very topical things of the moment. So yeah, that's in a nutshell.
Brilliant intro, Marieke. Thank you so much. And so you've had a toe in crypto, in TradFi, in fintech, and now in Web3 and kind of layer 1 protocol building. And part of why I wanted to have this conversation with you is I think we don't hear enough from objective voices at the center in leadership roles in Web3. We hear from a few eccentric founders. We hear from excited, agitating startups, and we've got no shortage of kind of trolls out there as well who have kind of very loud voices. But at the center of actually building and establishing ecosystems, this is where I find some of the most interesting work happens. And so my first question to you is, for those people who don't see what you do on a regular basis, the immense amount of work that you and your teams do on very long hours, on very long days and weekends, what does it actually take to build and scale a layer 1 ecosystem?
Yeah, and so couple of things actually that, making a parallel for when you come from more, let's say, traditional Web2 world. One is actually building a decentralized ecosystem is something that is very different, right? So actually, how do you empower and put yourself at the service of what others need, right? Which in particular for the team that is at the foundation, there is this very much this attitude of servant leadership, right? We work for others, we do what others need, and we actually try to figure out what is it, which is a very hard role because it's almost never enough. Never, right? There's almost always someone somewhere that doesn't have enough support or would want more, whether it's actually marketing support or funding support or whatever, right? So that is in itself a very difficult thing. The second part that is difficult is contrary to, normal traditional corporate, in which you would have, for example, like a vision from the top, and then, you have like, some sort of structure to say like, please follow the direction of the vision. Here, the reality is that at the core and heart of it, a layer one protocol like Near is open source. Anyone, anywhere can build whatever they want on it. And you don't really have a say in it, right? And so that is actually a shift and a paradox in that. And so when you think of the role we play in particular as a foundation, which is also like our role is to also become obsolete, right? Over time, how can we actually not exist? Because while we are, we can be a first pebble to actually help to the machine to start. Over time, the intention is not to actually, like you would have in a corporate, to be the biggest and bigger you can be, but it's actually to be the smaller and the smaller you can be, which also takes a mindset shift, right? Back to this idea of like serving others and how do you do that in the best possible way. So when we look at how to create a strong ecosystem, the way I often think about it is, one, for an ecosystem to function, it needs to be connected, right? And so the parallel with that would be, if you build a city, the city needs to have roads, and the city needs to have schools, and the city needs to have hospitals, like the basic of like what are the fundamental that are needed. And so that's what a foundation can actually help with. That, okay, do we have the roads, and do we have the schools, and do we have actually those fundamentals? Are we connected to other ecosystems? Because in crypto and blockchain, if you're just on your little island, you're not going to go really far, right? We're in a multi-chain environment, and so you actually need to have that adoption. The second part is also thinking through, okay, what is the knowledge that is needed, right? So what are the sources of either information, or sometimes it can also be access to funding? Because the reality is that to build, in particular in Web3, often you might need either like knowledge of how to do it, or you might need actually access to resources. So part of our job is also making that connection and making sure that people can actually connect and have what is needed, right? So I would say those are first ideas of what it takes to actually build and scale a protocol from a foundation perspective.
That's a really strong start, and I like the way you describe it. It's servant leadership on a massive scale, right? It's not I'm a servant leader and I have 10 direct reports, and I'm responsible for elevating their careers. It's we are servant leaders as an organization for an entire ecosystem that will eventually make us obsolete. We are basically creating and training an ecosystem that should be perpetual, persistent, and as Web2 people coming into Web3, or as corporate people stepping into Web3. The weird transition is you are not there to dictate. You are not there necessarily to set strategy. There are some areas, and there's constant tension where you can identify that there are needs or primitives or composable features that the ecosystem doesn't have today, and that might not be commercially viable to build. A startup's not going to spin up to create that. So there are areas where you might have to agitate or offer grants or offer some, like you said, that first movement to get things rolling, after which you then unblock that part of the ecosystem, and then you've got to make your way across to the other blocks, which is super, super interesting. Before we go any further, guys, please do let us know where you're coming from. Give us your GMs, wherever you're coming from today. We'd love to hear where in the world you're listening in from. Also, there's going to be live Q&A at the end of this session. So if you've got questions for Marieke, anything about her career track to date, around Near Foundation, anything you want to know about helping to lead, grow, and scale a blockchain ecosystem or a layer one, now is your time to ask. So please do. I'll try and filter through some of those questions. We'll try and get through as many of them as we can in the time we have available. I know Marieke's incredibly busy, so we're very lucky to have her time. So with that in mind, Marieke, again, a big part of what I think is really unique to Near is you set some very ambitious targets a year ago, listening into NearCon to 10x a number of different areas in the ecosystem, to set a number of different areas of priority. What have been some of your highlights over the last 12 months, or nearly your year as CEO? in terms of what you've been able to achieve despite relatively difficult conditions.
Well, yeah, and I think when it's really interesting because now we're obviously looking back at a year ago and how have we grown, and when I look actually at the number and the track we have on those, it's quite phenomenal. So, for example, one metric we track is number of active wallets, because actually an active wallet is an entry point into an ecosystem, and so on that front, we grew from below 100K active wallets to over 22 million active wallets. That's huge, right? To any point. And that's in very big part thanks to a key strategic partnership that we've done with Sweatcoin. And Sweat is an app that is actually a Web2 app. You basically move and you get Sweat points. And the idea was almost primed for becoming blockchain, but was not yet on blockchain. And we've been working with the Sweat team to actually help bring that over. And to me, that is actually such a beautiful example, because it's like, how do you bring a Web2 company onto Web3, which is not that easy because there is actually a lot of different things to think about, but also like, how is the Near technology able to do that? So for example, at NearCon, when Sweat went officially live, that was the largest airdrop in history, and all that went throughout without a glitch, right? That's really important. Now, of course, we have much more work to do to make sure that the Sweat users, for example, are more connected to the rest of the, but this is like, it's such a key pillar and movement. The other part I would say is also like the number of active developers that we see continuously grow. Of course, like in the recent like weeks and months, it's been a slightly different trend. But overall, again, if we take like a lens of from a year ago to now, like the growth is spectacular. Same for like the number of projects. I can't even remember what it was a year ago, but now we are close to 1,000 projects. And so like it was, and so things like that are just like the sheer growth in a year is absolutely phenomenal. And also I see more and more very concrete, use cases, which is what I'm passionate about. And when I see that, I think it's also what Near technology enables, is like things that don't need, you don't need to be a master in like cryptographic keys and like having to do magic tricks over 3 different things to be able to do something. So I think that is actually probably the biggest achievement. And the last thing I would say, because you mentioned NearCon, but I think NearCon was such a turning point for us as an ecosystem. It's our flagship conference. And actually, I was at NearCon a year ago, incognito, trying to say, like, you get a real sense for an ecosystem when you are actually in real life, right? Because otherwise everything is online. They're like, who are these people? What's going on? And I remember a year ago when I went, it was a little bit less than 600 people, but it has this like diversity and inclusion at core. And you could see that you could speak with anyone and people would answer. And there was like, this genuine want to share, to share information and knowledge and just this general passion. And this year it was close to 3,000 people, 176 countries represented, and 38% of women. And I think those stats are just, they speak for themselves, but also the vibe you had at that moment was a real important moment for the ecosystem. So yeah, I fully haven't digested the whole year, but it's been indeed quite an impressive year for the Near ecosystem.
It's been big, and I promise I'm not here to blow sunshine the entire time. It has been a huge amount of progress in a very short period of time, which can show you, if you have the right mix of technology, people, mission, objectives, metrics, what can be achieved. Now, the last 12 months have been a little bit of a roller coaster, shall we say, at the broader Web3 environment. And within that, we include centralized finance, we include decentralized finance, we include exchanges, protocols, layer 2s, builders, support systems, all of that, right? And I think a lot of people lose sight of the number of different facets that exist in Web3. But I would be remiss if I were not to ask you about the controversial events of Web3 in general in 2022. So when we've seen the likes of Luna struggle, 3 Hours Capital, and more recently FTX, what have been the learnings for you personally and for Near as a protocol? And what are the imperatives that give us to help continue growth of Near and Web3 for 2023?
Yeah, and look, so I actually think that having very strong convictions and actually always going back to that is really important. And for example, at Near, our conviction is it's ultimately about active engaged users. And so one thing, for example, the industry was extremely focused on, more TVL or price of things and metrics that might indicate something, but if you think technology, then it might not necessarily make full sense of like, why are we focusing on that? So I think actually the examples that we've unfortunately seen on that, and therefore the consequences they've had, the first thing that it reminds us all the time is actually ultimately building real use cases that deliver on the promises of Web3 is paramount, and is the first and thing like why we are all here and why we should want to be here. So this is not about hype. This is really about actually user engagement, and therefore having the right metrics, as you say, is extremely, extremely important. The other thing I would say is it's also a reminder of why we do what we do. Because in the examples that you mentioned, unfortunately, very often, it's not the ethos of Web3 that fails. It's not the decentralization that fails. It's not the fact that things are transparent and available on chain that fails. It's actually humans. It's, we're back to things that we have actually seen in more traditional finance or in more traditional world. And therefore, that's exactly everything that, we stand against as technologists, of saying like, well, there should be a better way to do things, right? So all those events are unfortunately not helpful for the entire industry, because we will all pay the price for actually, the reputation damage that's going to be done holistically. And you can very often see that. And I'm sure for people who are in the space, getting the call from the parents of like, are you okay? What's going on? Like, everybody's bundled up into the same thing, which is extremely hurtful. The other part is actually also thinking through, well, what are going to be the consequences from a regulatory perspective on that? And the reality is that we were making collectively good progress with regulators on, path forward. If you look, for example, at MiCA in Europe, and if you look at some of the work that had been happening also in the US and across the globe. And so my hope is that, we don't lose that. My hope is also that we look at the fundamentals of what is really intended, and that we also focus on the right metrics, because ultimately, more than ever, Web3 is needed. And when you look at what's happening on certain Web2 platform or social media platform, this is exactly why Web3 should exist, is not to be at the mercy of like, one person or very few people, and to actually have the ownership of what we do. So more than ever, we do need Web3. The reality is that Web3 needs to deliver and hasn't delivered yet. And so focusing on those real use cases and focusing on making that really happen through strong technology, strong teams, having the right KPI, having actually the right ethics as we behave through that, I think is extremely important.
Without trying, you've hit on two keywords there: three: behavior, technology, and ethics. That I posted out on about an hour and a half ago. Is that in all that we've seen in the last 24 months or 12 months more specifically, we haven't seen a significant failure in technology at a layer one level. We've seen some challenges around bridges. We've seen failure of ethics, failure of reporting, failure of oversight around exchanges, which are essentially bridges between Web3 and Web2, or Web3 and the traditional finance system. Tom Emma came out to, I think it was yesterday or last night, part of the prosecution on FTX, and said this was not a failure of the technology. We need decentralized technology, and we're grateful that actually the transparency around cryptocurrencies layer ones has enabled us to do all of the audit trail of what's happened in record time, which actually, for transparency, for authenticity, for quality, is hugely powerful. The fact is, though, that there are certain parties or certain entities within Web3 which are necessary, but where the ethics or the oversight isn't correctly managed, we're trusting in brands as opposed to being able to trust in code, which makes things a lot harder. So thank you for the unintended segue. Again, guys, as you come through, please do ask your questions to Marieke. She's got a wealth of knowledge, and honestly, genuinely has done probably more for a layer one ecosystem than most CEOs have over the last. If you think about the statistics she just described, unbelievable access here, and you guys have unfettered access to ask questions. So please do put those in the comments, so we've got some good things and some juicy questions to ask. I would be remiss if I weren't able to talk about enterprise as part of this. I know a number of the partnerships that Near and Near Foundation have forged over the last 12 months or so have been with some pretty significant enterprises in the space, not just necessarily enterprises building on Near, but also the infrastructure that surrounds Web3. How do you see the role that enterprise is going to play in getting us to scaling Web3?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on that. Actually, one, if Web3 keeps being in the, for, crypto native users and so on, the reality is that the pool is very small. So that's not going to achieve like mainstream adoption at all. So onboarding Web2 to Web3 is very important, right? And so how do you do that at scale? Very often is like through enterprises who have like already millions of users and who can be onboarded to Web3. Now, not every use case is fit for being Web3, right? Because I think also when projects come and they say, we want to do something on Web3, I'm like, why? What is it going to do that's different? And actually, what does it do for you users that needs Web3? And there's a wealth of different areas where it actually matters. For example, we see a lot in sports and entertainment and quite a lot on that. So the first point is actually that the fact that to get to mainstream adoption, the reality is that it's going to be a shift from Web2 to Web3 that happens. The thing we see is, and it's really interesting because it reminds me, the chief digital officer, or like when businesses were not online and we're like, oh, do we have to go online? And I started my career in the luxury goods industry for LVMH. And I remember at the time I was working in Asia Pacific and it was still the beginning of e-commerce, but there was a lot of debate and actually a lot of people were saying, oh, nobody will buy luxury goods on, online. Like that's never going to happen. Fast forward, I won't say how many years, but fast forward a number of years. And guess what's happening? Actually, it's happening, right? And so I think, and at that time, the shift we've seen is also like every large retailer has been thinking through how to digitize. Every bank has been thinking through that. That was, for example, my last experience, like how to innovate, how to digitize. And there's different models that enterprise do to do that. Sometimes they have a chief digital officer, sometimes they have a chief innovation officer, and you start small, and then before you know it, actually it overtakes the whole thing. Now, we're starting to see exactly the same thing with Web3. And what's been very interesting to see is that no matter what bumps happen, it's almost as if as technology, we've already made a step that the technology is here and it's not going to go away. And therefore, there is a very strong appetite for a lot of very large enterprises to say, okay, how do I adapt my business going forward? And what is it that I'm going to make doing with that? For Near in particular because of the strength of our technology, where we see mass appeal is everything that's related to sports, entertainment, and loyalty. And those are like cases that are almost prone to be disrupted by Web3. If you think of like, being a fan of a team, then you could say, oh, that looks like actually a membership club. And therefore, like, what if it's actually an NFT that you can actually really own and you can put more into? So there is definitely all those use cases that are starting to happen there that are very interesting. So yes, enterprises are going to play a very big role. And I haven't even touched on, for example, financial institutions and how the role that those institutions can play, which is also huge. But definitely enterprises are going to play a very big role because it's the path to get to mainstream. And honestly, the traction we see on that front and the work we are asked to do and to help with is just growing and growing, which is, I think, a very good indication. And I think the mental model for whomever is in the Web2 world is that, whatever you were and it looked like chief digital, chief innovation officer, I think we're replicating similar organizational model on that front.
It's nice to see. We are starting to see the chief metaverse officer creeping in as a title, which does amuse me because that feels like an even more intangible domain than Web3 at this point in time. But at least it's nice to see deliberate focus or deliberate intent towards a different paradigm or a different way of delivering with technology. I genuinely think that there is a significant tension between corporate objectives, corporate management, and decentralization and decentralized community engagement and creating shared economies, shared incentive models. And I like that you called out sports and sports fans specifically as a collective, because that's where digital assets, collective incentives, co-creation, which is at the heart of kind of Web3 principles and where the technology works really well, plays out very, very nicely. Also, a lot of or much of the content or the assets there can be digital or are natively digital, whereas the more you have to start creating tokenization of physical assets, the more complexity you have around it. Everybody's really excited about the concept of sustainability, around the concept of carbon credits, or being able to crowdfund sustainability projects. But we can solve for double spending in terms of one token, but how do we solve for the double spending in the real world, or the validation that projects actually exist? And it's not as easy to digitize and create those communities, particularly in a Web3 sense, in my experience, than it is in other areas. And the examples that you picked up,
it might be, but I have to jump here because we have a project called Open Forest Protocol, which actually tackles exactly that. And I think you're right. Yeah, it's like enabling the tracking of reforestation, and it's exactly what you say. How do you check like these projects really exist? Because there is indeed like value in having tokenized carbon credit, but then like what do you make? And so my point is we're starting to see some of this project emerge, which I think also could be a very big win. It's harder, as you've mentioned, but yeah, we're also starting to see that.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. I mean, shout out to Open Forest Protocol, and for anybody who is trying to do the work in making or trying to reduce as much friction as possible between that kind of phygital or physical to digital asset conversion, because being able to have appropriate science behind carbon sinks, or being able to appropriately attribute the benefit of reforestation. It doesn't happen the second you plant a seed. It happens at the point where you have tree. And so there's complexity in all of that. And it's as much the metrics that we are applying to the corporates who are looking for these credits as they are to the technologists who are trying to build low friction, easy to integrate experiences. But it's great to hear that it's on the radar.
It is.
I wonder, good. I wonder, are there other particular verticals that you see might drive that kind of next billion users? I mean, we haven't talked about central bank digital currency or the way that governments are specifically looking at blockchain technology and digital assets. There are a bunch of other verticals we haven't covered. Are there any of particular focus for you and Nia that you haven't mentioned so far?
Well, I think I've mentioned, sports entertainment, because it's definitely one. If you think also of, history, Web 1, Web 2, and how adoption has happened, very often that's where it started. And so here, no surprise, we're seeing the same path of adoption for Web 3. I think the point you're mentioning also on governments and central bank is definitely very interesting. So at the core and the heart of a lot of the philosophy of crypto and Web3 is also like, peer-to-peer movement of value. And therefore, what's the value that we think immediately most of is actually money. And so peer-to-peer movement of money that touches, what are stable coins, what is the digital currency that we have in our hands, and therefore what can the technology do on that front. I think we will probably continue to see more innovation in DeFi, especially given what we've seen recently happen and the strengths and the resilience of what DeFi has shown. So I think we can expect more on that front. I think for things that touch stablecoin or CBDC, while regulators across the world have made a ton of progress in like their understanding and their therefore ability to grasp what it means for society and for the rest of the world, I think we're still couple of years away from seeing like a true CBDC completely embraced and on chain by any nation. There are quite a lot of different projects and pilots that are happening in lots of different places. But it's going to be interesting to continue seeing that. So I don't know, what part it will play into mass adoption and helping the speed. I'm more hopeful on, again, sports entertainment, because I think that's where the immediate use case and the transformation of that. Anytime you think of like ownership of IP, and ownership of IP can be like, a sports person, that he or her, the sports people are IP themselves, right? And so like there is a value there in like shifting that rather than having to go through the traditional model as we know it. So the use case is so flagrant that I think then it becomes almost like the first adoption for that. But yeah, definitely, I think DeFi will also help be an enabler for adoption on that front.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So keep an eye out for sports and entertainment. I believe back in the day, you were something of a sports person yourself. Am I correct?
Still.
Still.
Yeah. Well, no, sports is I love sports in general. I think it's a beautiful thing. But I used to play basketball, and so that's where my passion is.
And I may have looked that up. And so as a result, when you see the first kind of sports related digital assets coming out as an NBA related and basketball related, did that give you some early inspiration? Were you inspired when you saw that, or did that feel a bit weird at the time?
No. I was very inspired because I thought, oh, wow, look at that. Like, again, musicians, artists, sports people are very often also innovators, and they come at things and they use technology in a different way. And so I was extremely excited by that. I think it's also when, you remember the times of like collecting cards of players or things like that. Oh yeah, imagine if you could do that, not with paper, but in a different way. So any case that actually brings it to real world adoption, I'm actually extremely excited about. And anything that has a twist of, again, entertainment in a different way, I think is also extremely interesting. So yeah, I think definitely exciting to see. Even one of the local basketball club where I played when I was younger, which is in France, actually also started thinking through what does it mean to be owned by fans. And I was like, oh my God, look at that. It's happening in other different places. And so I think that's extremely exciting. Yeah.
Okay, and I want to transition on that one because you do actually have a specific project where, as part of I believe the SailGP collabo, there's actually fan engagement in part of helping to run or support or make decisions on behalf of the team. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. Well, yes. So SailGP is one of the partnerships that we have, and so SailGP is actually reinventing racing, but doing that on water with boats that are absolutely phenomenal. And it's racing with high-speed boats that use only wind, so therefore it's also sustainable, which is a core thing at the heart of that competition. And we've been partnering with SailGP on several different fronts, but one of which is actually imagine if a DAO owns a team. And so that has been announced a couple of weeks ago, but there is a launch of a DAO that's fully going to own, for the first time in sports history, a fully professional team. And so what SailGP has done is actually opening up to say, yes, the next team we're actually putting on the market, we're okay for that to be owned by a DAO. That's a big deal. And it's not by no means a small thing to do, because structuring a DAO, like thinking through, okay, what are the legal regulations to do that, and how do you actually think through that? And then, like, a DAO is a collective of people who vote together on where they want to steer the team. Okay, so how do you structure within a DAO? Like, do you have completely flat organization? You still need a team of people who are going to do the work, and so how do you actually structure that? So it's raised a lot of fascinating questions, and I think it's been honestly amazing to work with the team on that front to like, again, do a first in sports history to help plant a flag of like what are the possibilities of what could happen going forward, and prove again that you can have real use cases that are helpful and that are actually showing that you can transform an entire industry. And here it's sailing and sports in particular.
I love that. And honestly, as a sports fan, but also as somebody as a fan of innovation, please do share as much about that as you possibly can with the general public, because I think that's an incredibly powerful case. I know that every armchair fan wants to be able to pick the team on a Saturday or on a Sunday. And I don't know exactly how real time or what sort of latency you have on the decision making, whether it's sail to port, sail to starboard in the actual races, or whether it's beforehand. But genuinely, the potential for engagement there, I think, with an actual sports team, in a licensed and supported championship, that is huge. Genuinely, that's massive. That's massive for DAOs. That's massive for blockchain. That's massive for sports. So please let the rest of the world know as much as you can about that, because I genuinely believe it's groundbreaking, and it sets a very meaningful example that other people can relate to. And on the subject of things that people can relate to, before we go to the Q&A, I wondered if you could take a pause, reflecting on your near first year at Near. That sounded weird, but your almost anniversary at Near Foundation, obviously a part of a much broader career in finance and Web3. What advice would you give to anybody who's coming into the space at this time, whether that be an enterprise, whether that be somebody coming in to start their career, or somebody looking to transition from Web2 into Web3? What would you give as guidance of people coming in at this particular moment?
Yeah. So starting with a pause. So the first thing is actually, it's a great time to build. And I know it's a sentence that's almost overused, but the reality is, in bear market, when there is no noise, forget about, the hype and the FOMO of almost like, oh my God, am I missing on something? In a bear market, it's back to basics. It's back to being actually, a bit boring, but it's back to actually building. And so I think it's a very good time, one, probably to have access to some of the best talent that's going to be out there, because the reality is the macroeconomic context and what we're seeing in terms of broader layoff in Web2 and more generally in tech means that there's going to be an influx of phenomenal talent that's going to be also on the market. The second one I would say is that actually the blockchain technology and technology in general in Web3 has made a ton of progress. And so when I look at that, it's not, a couple of years ago, the technology was not in the same place. Today, as we've been talking about here, right, you can build real stuff. That's it. This is now mainstream, right? You can have millions of users, and you can have real applications that are seamless, and actually that don't mean you need to have a full lexicon of jargon to know what you have to do. So that is now available and exists. The advice I would actually give is thinking through, well, what's actually the best technology to build on? And I'm going to preach for my own church here, but having technology that is infinitely able to scale, that actually doesn't hurt the environment, that's been thought through. And that's one of the things that we've been thinking through at Near since the start of how to be actually sustainable. Having technology that, if it continues to evolve, it evolves and it doesn't disrupt any of the things that you've built on top of it. I think those things are extremely important. So continue making sure that you build where there's been proof points. I think that's really important. And the other thing would be having, patience, but also going back always to basics, right? Building on Web3 is not just because it's cool. It's because it can do something very fundamentally different. It's because you can flip on its head some of the paradox, right? You can truly give back ownership to the creators of what they have created forever in their journey. You can truly flip on its head what it means to be a fan of a sports team, or what it means to actually be the IP owner of something. So I think solving real problems, being patient, and doing that on technology that is proven and that can scale. Hint, Near. Those are probably some very good advice. And I think it's usually in times like that we will see, and I don't know how long it's going to take, but I don't know if the bear market we're in is like 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, don't know. But it is in this moment that the next future big players that are going to shape the world of tomorrow and the world for our kids are being built. And so it's the right time to do that and to focus on those basics and those fundamentals to be able to deliver that.
Really great guidance, and we'll forgive you for the shameless plug, because you wouldn't be doing your job if you didn't. But I think also I kind of noticing what you said, building in a market where there's uncertainty, or building in a market where there are lower market capitalizations, doesn't prohibit access to capital, doesn't prohibit access to talent. In fact, it accelerates in some cases access to talent. It doesn't prohibit good ideas from being funded. It doesn't prohibit good ideas from being tested and validated in the market. And so, yes, maybe you'll get access to a little bit more, again, a bit more of a boost when everyone's feeling good. But at the same time, if you have a transformative idea that can make use of novel technology, there's no better time to get started. And don't consider that you will fail just because the market conditions outside are a bit wonky, would be my take. So thank you very much for that. We've got a few questions, quite a lot of questions. So I'm going to do my best to multitask and filter. This is not my strength, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try and kind of filter through some of these. And so if you see my eyes disappearing off to the side of the screen, it's only because I'm trying to process through hundreds and hundreds of comments here. Thank you, everybody, for making my life hard and adding all of these questions and comments in the chat. Please do add any more. We might just be able to get through all of these if we can be quick. But let's start with a nice and easy one. This is a great question from Zara here. How would you define mass adoption? Now, she said, what percentage of the population would need to be part of the movement? maybe we don't think of it in terms of percentages, but at near for yourselves, how do you define the target of mass adoption?
Yeah, fantastic question. So instead of mass adoption, I prefer mainstream adoption. And the click for me is when we don't have to explain anymore what is blockchain. Because today, a lot of time is like, and a layer one is this, and to do this, you need to do that. So we will have reached that point when it's seamless. You actually are using something as Web3, but you don't know, right? And it's really doing something differently, right? So I think that's when we reach that. And then in terms of, millions of users, some could say, because if you look today at the total number of crypto wallets in the world, you could say, okay, we're ready at something mainstream. I don't know. So rather than percentage, I was more look at usability and the fact that we don't have to explain. And, my mom picks up something and she's like, oh, I didn't know this was on blockchain. Great. That's it.
Love that. We've reached mass adoption when we don't use the word blockchain anymore, or when we're not talking about it. When the infrastructure it becomes the infrastructure, and we're talking about great applications. And you've highlighted a few of them over the course of today's session, which is great. Here's a good one from Tommaso, if I'm pronouncing that anywhere near correctly. What do you see in terms of the state of Web3 adoption, comparing and contrasting Europe and the United States?
Great question. So in Europe, and I think my statement is going to be pretty more general to what we see in tech in general, right? By definition, we are a much more fragmented continent. And so what it means is that different languages, different cultures, and therefore like different rate of adoption of things. I think as European entrepreneurs, we also tend to be less hypey, less flamboyant, and much more focused on actually building. And therefore might get like less traction in terms of what's being deployed. So I would say from that end and that perspective, in terms of adoption, we're probably a bit behind. However, one thing for sure is in terms of overall regulation and openness, I think Europe has been probably a bit more opened actually in what is possible and what are some of the use cases. But good question. I don't have actually any stats top of my head. But yeah, I would say the paradigm we see are pretty similar Web 2 to what we see in Web 3 on that front.
Nice. In the absence of stats, I might ask then for a small double click, because I think regulation is a word that is consistently used as what we need to do better at, or what will unlock the floodgates of Web3 wide scale adoption. What do you, when you give examples in terms of what Europe's doing well, or what are some examples of what's helpful, what are some of the things that you see that we're doing well, or where regulation is helping Web3 adoption at this point?
Good question. I think the, thorough, dedicated, methodical approach, I would say, that's been happening across Europe, I think is quite helpful. Some might say, for example, if you look at MiCA, maybe, not everything in MiCA is what everybody wants. However, there is a framework, and that's moving forward. I think that's definitely something I would highlight. It's also very de-emotionalized, if that makes sense. I think one thing we can make more progress on is, in particular, it was true in the first half of 2022, but it felt every time there was a big regulatory movement in Europe about to happen, it was always on a Friday evening for about going on a Monday. I was like, oh my God, can we just like take pause, hit, and have a chat a bit before? So, I think it's this thorough approach continuing is going to be extremely important going forward. And just one thing on regulation, it's a bit linked, but leveraging the transparency that blockchain enables is actually a superpower for regulation. And so I think we need to think also beyond the existing framework, not like trying to, square, what blockchain does into existing framework, but more, what is it that the technology can help do even better and provide, for example, more transparency. Imagine having access to, proof of reserve, like on an immediate response, not like an audit that you need to wait a year. Because right now I look at a company's audit of like a year ago, I'm like, I don't even care, because like a year is like 10 years, right? So like I can look at it, but what does it really tell me, right? So that would be some hints on that question.
Really nice. And I realize it's a complex question. It's not exactly, you can't just kind of give a throwaway answer to those ones. So thank you for bearing with me. I think also that you pointed towards actually the kind of the B2B side of regulation and transparency, proof of funds is super important. I think we've got a real tension on the privacy perspective, Web3 coming up as promoting, self-custody, promoting anonymity or pseudonymity. and then seeing the contrast of kind of KYC in Web2 fintech retail with the ability to have anonymity while also having transparency in Web3. The second you dox somebody in Web3 with a KYC, the second you have access to everything in their wallet that happens over here. And so understandably, you've got a real tension between the retail side of it. But on a B2B side, I think there's a huge amount of potential to protect and encourage innovation. So I'm positive that we're seeing enough movement in the right direction, but we've still got some crunchy stuff to solve. Here's a good one, and specifically kind of fits in the kind of the ethos of near being easy to use. What are the best ways to make Web3 more seamless for the average Web2 user who doesn't care about Web3? So the mother or the grandmother, or what are some of the things that you and the team are focusing on to make Web3 easier?
Yeah, so there's actually two parts to that. One is for the end user, what does it look like to log in, right? And so, for example, imagine today if you use a browser and you log in with Google, then actually that gives you access to a lot of things. So imagine actually transcripting that into Web3, and instead of a Google login, it becomes like a wallet login, and actually that wallet is maybe pre-funded, and so you don't see some of the transactions. Here's another thing that actually helps make it usable. Rather than having to click for every transaction to happen, then actually it's seamless and you don't see that. And one way to think about that is, for example, back in the days when we used to send SMS, it was paper SMS. And then it changed, and then it became a subscription. And actually, with that subscription, you can do a certain amount of things. It doesn't mean it's free. It just means like you have now access to a bundle of those things. Things like that. So thinking through like login and thinking through like bundle subscription type model are definitely things that help on usability. The other part of usability is actually usability for developers. And that's actually really important because we're still early on and there's still a lot of building. What does usability for developer mean? It means one, well, what's the language on which you can code? And the reality is today, for example, most Web3 development is still done in Solidity and in Rust. But those languages are like there is 100,000 or 200,000 developers in the world who actually know how to code in Rust and Solidity. So the pool of people who can actually help build is too small. So for example, at Near, we have JavaScript enabled for JavaScript developer to be able to develop. And so that already opens up also usability and therefore like the ability to build. So I would say to get that mainstream adoption for usability, this like login subscription model, and then simplicity for developer to actually be able to code fast and have all the tools and be able to code in the languages that are most known are probably some of the things that are the best way to actually get seamless usage.
I love that. Particularly the last part. I think it's often overlooked that all of the existing engineers that are developing software and all of the rest of Web2 don't often program in Rust, or very rarely, if ever, program in Solidity. And so the easier we can make it for the existing software engineering engine of the world to start adopting, integrating, composing with the technology that we're building, the better, because that's going to make the rest of it move faster. So dev tooling, low code, no code solutions, languages that people know how to code in, really, really big, really, really important point. So thank you for highlighting that one. So the next question, we've had that one. Let's jump to a question about the metaverse, if we may. Again, super early domain. I posted out the other day, the metaverse is probably only 2 years old in terms of genuine, concerted, consolidated effort towards making this a domain of interest. I mean, if you want to go all the way back to Snow Crash as the equivalent of the Satoshi white paper for the metaverse, the idea of it's been around forever. The idea of avatars and virtual reality has been around since the 80s. But if we look at the current incarnation of the metaverse, what's your definition, or what do you see as the importance of metaverse in and around what you're building?
Yeah, I love that question. Thanks for asking, Todd. So, the skeptic in me would say, haven't we rebranded again, the industry? Because, it started, there was Bitcoin, then, okay, that's not the word, then use blockchain, then, okay, crypto, then actually now use, Web3, and now, metaverse, right? So there is also a trend of like, what's the word that does what we describe in a way? But that's the skeptic in me that would say maybe there's a bit of that. The second part And I love that because once someone asked me, how do I enter the metaverse? I was like, oh, yeah, great question. How do you enter? Is this the metaverse? You know, are we in the metaverse? And so I think to me, and maybe it's too simplistic, and I'd love, by the way, to have also your view on how you define it. But to me, it's more the fact that increasingly our lives are becoming digitized, and therefore with that, the assets that we carry with us in that digital world. And so if you think of living lives that are more and more digitized, what does it mean to actually have our identity, our assets, and the values that we hold and that we create within that space? And therefore, because it's online and digital, then that's the metaverse. So that's how I think about it. I'm not sure if it's a good definition or not, but yeah, what's your definition of it?
I think it's a great definition, and frankly, we don't have a strong one, because I think a lot of people still make the misconception that the metaverse has to include virtual reality, or that to be in the metaverse we have to strap in through VR goggles, which I think immediately creates bias. And one of my pet peeves in general around technology and innovation is around when people bring bias to the conversation. I think there's a strong overlap between principles where the metaverse is aiming versus where Web3 is aiming at the same time. So we talk about experiences that are persistent, digital, where like you said, the individual is self-sovereign, or that their data, what they create, is owned and managed by them. It cannot be censored. It cannot be taken down. So immediately parallels with Web3. I think co-creation is a big part of it as well. So where actually multiple parties can come together to solve problems, work together, play together, whatever the human need is, it is immersive, it is co-creative, it is multi-party. Those are some of the guiding principles that I like to use. I don't think it has to involve crypto necessarily, but you can see benefits of tokenization for shared incentives, right? You can see the benefit of decentralized governance, or the use of on-chain digital governance in a metaverse context. I think most people also assume that it's always B2C, or that it's brands selling stuff to individuals. I see a lot of the use cases for the metaverse being B2B. For example, we already today have immersive environments, in this case with virtual reality, where you have designers co-creating vehicles, furniture, etc., because they're working remotely halfway around the world. They need a platform to come together. It's involving virtual reality because it's a 3D space where they have to interact and shape and so on. And that's being done today by car companies, largely driven by the pandemic and the requirement to work remotely instead of people coming together. But then actually, if you can then crowdsource people, content, engagement, and so on, and you can attribute contribution and then fairly value that contribution, again, you're starting to overlap a little bit of Web 2 and Web 3 in an immersive space. And that to me starts to feel like metaverse. The other question I like to ask is, are you creating a video game? Right? So if this is basically the same as Minecraft, you are not creating a metaverse platform. Mm-hmm. Right? You have a centralized server. You've created a computer program where multiple people can come in together and follow the rules of the computer program. Right? Or you're on a WebEx. Right? As I don't think we're in the metaverse now. But
maybe it's, you know, there's V1, there's V0, V1. I love your definition, by the way, co-creation, you know, and fair attribution of who's done what. That's very powerful as a framework. Yeah.
Very good. We've probably got time for one or two more, so I'm going to try and pick. This is a good one here from Michael. Michael asks, is NEAR involved in any decentralized identity projects? So there's a really strong community out there for decentralized identity. Michael's obviously one of the proponents of that. What's your view on DID? Is that something that you've seen a lot of in the NEAR community at the moment? Anything that you can highlight at this time?
Yeah, well, look, I would actually highlight something that at this stage is more proof of concept, but it was really interesting. It's called NEAR.social. And on NEAR.social, which at the moment is mostly a platform for developers to have different widgets and start co-creating things, there is a very core element of that, which is around actually identity. And therefore, it looks into decentralized identity and what that would mean. So I would say that's probably one of the things that comes to mind. And then the other part of that comes to mind is more, you know, in most crypto ecosystem today, the entry point still remains the wallet, right? And so what's the link between a wallet and an identity, right? I think that is still like the link that that needs to be made or not, and therefore how to actually think that through. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you for that one. I've got a question here from an anonymous user, or at least it appears anonymous to me. It might be one of your team asking this, but if it is a plant, it's still a good question to ask. If there was a team deciding to build a product on Near, what would be the kind of benefits that you specifically would describe around Near that others can't provide? I promise this is not a plug. We did not screen this one.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Thank you for that great question. So I would say a couple of things. So one, actually, the technology for Near, so seamless, scalable, and very robust. That's what's been proven over and over. So if you come to Near, definitely you can be sure that you're sitting and standing on very strong technology. The second part, and actually I think it matters a lot, in particular in the environment that we're in right now, is that we've been very cautious also on how we think through actually funding and treasury allocation. And therefore, when we think for Near, we think very long term, right? And the treasury that is available for the Near ecosystem is very large, and it's we've raised over $500 million between January and April of this year, and we've been conservative in how we think through that, and how we actually have and held that in fiat and in traditional banking system. So I think those are things that matter, because as you know, the bear market continues being bearish. Unfortunately, we're probably going to see a lot of projects going under, and therefore being conscious on resources and thinking through long term for the entire ecosystem is really important. And then the third thing I would say is just the depths of bench that we have in terms of talent in the ecosystem. And that I would actually classify in two things. One is it's an extremely diverse and inclusive ecosystem. And it's an ecosystem that is extremely, multi-geography, that pans out from anything across Asia, Korea, to, Southeast Asia, to actually Africa, to Latin America, Eastern Europe, Europe in general, and of course the US. So it's a very multilingual, therefore, not just prone on English speaking. And I think that actually matters a lot, because it means that going forward, you have a lot of different brains thinking and actually coming up with their cultural background. That matters a lot. And then the other part, of course, is the depth and bench of the Near ecosystem. And I was just on a call earlier with a venture capital fund who is interested in investing more in the Near ecosystem. And the feedback was, well, the depths of teams and the depths of quality of builders on Near is phenomenal, because actually there is a lot of very deep technology ability across our entire ecosystem and all the projects. And so I think that's to build the next generation is really important. And so, yes, so my TLDR, because it's a bit long, but the tech is amazing. We have the funding and we have phenomenal talent across the ecosystem.
There we go. Thank you so much. Probably a good place to wrap up. We've reached actually the end of time. There were still about a bunch of questions that we could have continued on, but thank you so much for everybody who's joined. Thank you for everybody who's come into the chat. And most especially, Marieke, thank you so much to you for giving us an insight into the world of a Layer 1 Foundation CEO, for being very honest and very open with your insights and what you've shared with us today. Wishing you every success, hopefully some good rest over the holiday season. And thank you very much again for joining the show.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for having me. And thank you all for all your questions and for tuning in. And yes, I wish everybody a very peaceful end of 2022 and hopefully a very good 2023 when we get there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Marieke. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.